Welcome everybody to Medieval Women Mystics, Hildegard of Bingen and Julian of Norwich in Jungian perspective in celebration of National Women's History Month. My name is David Odorisio and I am Associate Core Faculty both in Pacifica's Mythological Studies as well as new online Psychology, Religion and Consciousness MA PhD program. It's really a pleasure to be with you and to speak towards two extraordinarily courageous, creative, and very powerful women from the Middle Ages. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So once again, welcome. I'm going to jump right in here, starting with the Jungian perspective first. So what does Jung say about mysticism? Jung defines mystical experience as experience of the archetypes. So it's a direct experiential encounter with what he would call the core of a certain religion or religious tradition. In this sense, direct mystical experience. So for a medieval Christian mystic, it would be a direct experiential encounter with the archetype of the self, which in the Christian tradition would be considered Christ, but also a direct experience or apprehension of the presence of God. So that's where Jung is starting. He's starting with this experiential piece, right? So direct experience of the archetype. So the archetype of the self or God. For Erich Neumann, he's following Jung. And for him, mysticism, building upon this definition, if mysticism or mystical experience is an experience of the archetype, then to Neumann, mysticism becomes central to the individuation process itself. So again, this notion of direct experience, transformational experience, direct encounter with the immediate presence of the archetype or of the divinity itself. So mysticism becomes central to Neumann, to the individuation process. In Jung's late work, Answer to Job, he talks about the transformation of God images. And this is where I connect the two. Following Neumann here, that it's through the direct encounter or the direct relationship with the archetype that humans actually continue the evolution or the incarnation of God. Now, that's a weighty statement. And there's a long history behind Jung, going back through the German mystics, that I think supports this this thread. But it's in Jung's Answer to Job that he really outlines how when the human encounter with the archetype, the human encounter with the deity, in this instance, Job's encounter with Yahweh, that it's through wrestling and really struggling with the archetype of the self. Wrestling with divinity, that humans actually transform not only themselves, but have the potential to transform the deity or to transform these God images themselves. And that's where I think mystics come into this conversation, lived human embodied mystics. Because, for example, with Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, it's through their direct spiritual, visionary, mystical encounters, whether it's with Hildegard and her experience of the living light, or Julian of Norwich and her visions of Christ. It's through these direct experiential encounters that they actually, from my perspective, transform and continue the evolution of our images of God. And the fact that they are both women, I think, gives them a certain perspective and transforms these God images in a novel and creative way that that male mystics simply, perhaps would not be able or capable of doing. And that's what we're going to look at today. So with both of these female mystics, we see an emphasis on the recovery of matter, an emphasis on matter and materiality and of spirit, the very incarnational vision of matter, the recovery of the maternal dimension of God, the recovery of the body, as well as the redemption of evil, particularly with Julian of Norwich. So let's take a look now at each of these and see how each of these medieval mystics participates in the transformation of these God images. So we'll start with Hildegard of Bingen, who was called in her time the Sibyl of the Rhine. And for those who are interested in diving deeper, I'm following here a chapter from a book by a Jesuit scholar named William Harmless, and the book is simply called Mystics, and he has an excellent chapter on Hildegard of Bingen if you want to dive deeper. So Hildegard of Bingen, according to Harmless, quoting him, one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages. She was an abbess, a visionary, a musician, a composer, a dramatist and poet, an herbalist, a reformer, and also a preacher and a theologian. Now, I have these two terms asterisked here because she was the first in this sense. She was the first woman preacher and the first female theologian who received canonical approval, so approval from the church to preach, as well as to write and to act in the capacity of a theologian, which is rather extraordinary, of course, for her time. Hildegard was the 10th child of her family. She was offered at the age of 8. That's probably sounds strange to us today, but this was a somewhat common practice for large families to offer the youngest to a monastery. So she was offered at age 8 to sort of apprentice with an anchoress. An anchoress is a female hermit named Jutta, who taught Hildegard Latin. And then eventually Hildegard goes on to become the abbess of the Benedictine monastery at Disseboden. And then she later founds her own monastery at Eibingen. In both of these instances, the women who were joining or coming to these monasteries were what would have been considered noble women. So they were part of an educated and artistic, definitely upper class. So the sense that we get of her monasteries is that they were filled with creative, educated, learned women who came from families of means. So they had dowries, they had the ability to do the sorts of creative work that they did. And Hildegard certainly had a very creative legacy that she left behind. In 1141, at age 42 and 7 months, Hildegard's very specific, she says that heaven was opened and a fiery light of exceeding brilliance came and permeated my whole brain and inflamed my whole heart. So this is the beginning of her first visionary experiences, sort of revelatory downloads, if you will. And she describes this experience using a variety of key terms. One is the shadow of the living light versus the living light. This is how she defined the experience that she had of this fiery light of exceeding brilliance that permeated her whole brain. The shadow of the living light, which were sort of minor visions, versus the living light itself, which was when she would have almost these kind of ecstatic visionary opening experiences. She also had this wonderful term called viriditas, a greening. This is very much an early, almost kind of eco-psychology, which describes as the vigor, the vibrancy, or the health, the growing power or life force in nature itself, the greening power of the Holy Spirit in the incarnation. So this notion of matter and materiality being infused, being infilled with the vigor and the vibrancy and the power of the Holy Spirit. I mentioned that she was a composer. She created over a period of 10 years a symphony. She described music as enabling us to get beyond the music of this present exile, so the suffering of our human existence, and to recall to mind that divine melody of praise which Adam, in company with the angels, enjoyed in God before his fall. Music making echoes the incarnation. So for Hildegard, music is that which actually restores us to this sort of original relationship with the deity or with God. So Adam walking in the garden before the original sin, so to speak. So it restores this original relationship. So she gives music very music is very central to her visionary experience in her life and her thought. Hildegard also created her own language called lingua ignota, an unknown language, which she created a glossary for corresponding terms in Latin. So this is a remarkable woman, absolutely remarkable, very creative, what we might consider today a polymath in the sense of just her interests in all of these different topics and areas and expertise. Hildegard today is best known for her work, the Scipias, from the Latin scito vios domini, to know the ways of the Lord, which is another work that took her about 10 years to complete. It's very much a multimedia work, and it's in 3 parts, 6 visions around the creation, 7 visions around redemption, and 13 visions around the history of salvation. Very similar to Jung's Red Book, Hildegard first outlines her vision itself, and then there's a layer of commentary that follows it. And she very much considered it a channeled text and insisted, and I'm quoting William Harmless here, insisted on her capacities of mediumship. So she definitely saw herself as really channeling this inspiration of the living light that was coming through her. A later manuscript is illuminated with 35 illustrations. Hildegard did not illuminate these herself, but other monks, based on her writings, illuminated these manuscripts. They are extraordinarily, again, quoting William Harmless here, there's a kinetic effect. They almost look or appear as if they are vibrating or moving. There's very much this extraordinary luminosity to these illuminations themselves. So what we're looking at here is her vision of the Trinity. And this is how she describes it in her own words. I saw a bright light, and in this light, the figure of a man, the color of a sapphire, which was all blazing with a gentle glowing fire. And that bright light bathed the whole of the glowing fire, and the glowing fire bathed the bright light. And the bright light and the glowing fire poured over the whole human figure, so that the 3 were one light. So this is her very creative and novel approach to the Trinity. She's taking very traditional Christian doctrine here, notion of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. However, what she's doing here is extraordinarily imaginative and very creatively revisioning the inner working of the Trinity, of the 3 in one, and the way in which the light, the glowing fire, and the sapphire man are sort of all interpenetrating one another, so that the 3 become one. And you'll notice that the human here is at the center. So there is this kind of almost mystical humanism to her work, in the sense that the human incarnational embodiment is very central to Hildegard's vision. And the terms, or the way, the images that she uses to describe the Trinity himself are entirely drawn from nature. So as a stone, as a flame, as compared to human speech, it's a very earthy, embodied nature to Hildegard's theology. Now, my recommendation, I mentioned that this was a multimedia work. My recommendation would actually be to either pause this presentation now, or when you're finished watching this, to go to YouTube and do a search for Margot Fassler. Her name is here, Margot Fassler, on Hildegard of Bingen's Cosmos. And if you watch starting at minute 39, you'll see Margot Fassler's multimedia recreation of potentially how Hildegard saw these visions and heard the music, again, potentially at the same time. So Margot Fassler is an extraordinary scholar who sort of combined music, word, and image to recreate what the visionary experience might have looked like. And I'm very grateful to one of my mythological studies students who did some research and brought this to my attention. So moving on to Julian of Norwich. Now, you'll notice here from the dates, Julian lived about 200 years after Hildegard. But similar, it wasn't until later in her life, about midlife, that she had her first visionary experience. She lived as an anchoress in Norwich in England. And at the age of 30 and a half, she had her first visionary experience, which we can understand as a sort of near-death experience. And we have the date, it was May of 1373. Julian received 16 visions and what she called 3 desires. The first being a mind of Christ's passion, which was an experiential, embodied reliving of the suffering of Christ on the cross. The second, bodily sickness. So she prayed for this. She prayed for some sort of bodily sickness. And then 3 wounds: contrition, compassion, and divine longing. So this is sort of her mysticism of reenacting or reliving the suffering of Christ, which was certainly a very strong theme in medieval Christian mysticism and medieval Christian piety. But for Julian, it takes on this extraordinarily personal, immediate, direct significance that she is actually reliving it herself. Now, why? We can, some of the context here, the wider cultural context was, this was the era just around the Black Death or the Black Plague, where significant portions, some scholars have said as much as 30 to 50% of Europe died during the Black Plague. So there is this sort of cultural mourning. There's this sort of cultural trauma that European society had experienced, and I'm certainly not reducing Julian's experience to this sort of psycho-spiritual type of trauma, but I do think that the context is important, because I think that individuals can carry the suffering of the wider collective and attempt to work through it in their own ways. And especially if we stay with this definition of mysticism as encounter with the archetype, it's almost as if Julian is doing her own cultural mourning or archetypal grief work through her own psychosomatic spiritual visionary experience. So Julian composed 2 texts based on these visions. The first one is known as the short text, the other is the long text. The short text is more immediate. It's more of the sort of the meat of the revelations themselves, and then the long text incorporates additional theological reflection. Some of the themes from her showings include the infinite compassion of God, Jesus as mother, and perhaps most radically, the necessity of sin. So she has a very interesting theology, revision theology of sin. As I just mentioned, one of the ways to interpret her visionary experience as sort of this near-death experience is an enactment of a private public grief ritual. Because and part of what is supporting my thinking here is because her visions of Christ are absolutely gruesome. I mean, they're extremely visual and very bloody and very physical. She describes it with very intense and specific detail around visualizing the wounds of Christ. So we can see Julian as almost as a wounded healer, because healing is ultimately one of the fundamental messages of her theology. In chapter 4, she has an extraordinary vision of the world as a hazelnut. You can see in this icon here, she has a hazelnut in the palm of her hand, but she sees it as the vision of the world as it is in God's hands, that God made it, God loves it, and God keeps it. So there's this extraordinary vulnerability and humility around the human experience, but also around the planet itself and our experience on this planet. That is something that's very, very fragile, very tiny, very small, but kept and loved and made in the hands of God. Chapter 13 is when we see her revised theology of sin. And this is where she famously states that sin is behovely. Sin is a Middle English term for useful or necessary. So sin is necessary not actually something that causes us simply, shame or punishment, but that for her, that sin is actually a necessary part of the human experience, and it's actually part of our own growing process. So again, we can draw very interesting connections here between her theology of sin as necessary in the process of individuation, and how we grow and how we evolve and how we move closer to the archetype, to the self, to God. So this is a quote from Julian: "When God did show me sin, it was then that God said, 'All will be well.'" So there's this ultimate, from a God's eye lens, or from a God's eye perspective. Sin is actually part of this sort of grand plan of what ultimately weaves the threads and the strands of who we are. And so rather than it being again, like something to be self-blaming or punishing towards, Julian's experience is that when God does show her the reality of sin, God says to her, "All will be well." There's an acceptance. There's this unconditional love around her humanness, around her humanity. And then in chapter 15, this extraordinary refrain that just repeats itself and resounds throughout parts of the text. "I will make all things well. I shall make all things well. I may make all things well. And I can make all things well. And you will see that yourself, that all things will be well." And this is, of course, the voice of the deity. This is the voice of God, as revealed to Julian through these visions of absolutely immense, profound suffering that she takes upon herself to have this restorative and healing experience of being held in the hands of God. So I want to close here with a quote from the 20th century psychoanalyst Luce Irigaray, from her essay Divine Women, where she says that a female God is still to come. And we could probably revision this today, saying a goddess is still to come, in the sense that the majority of our God images, if not exclusively over the past 2 millennia or more, have been very phallocentric or male-centric. And what Irigaray is saying is that a female goddess is still to come, but I think there's been extraordinary leaps and developments and evolutions of this God image, really over the past 40, 50 years, as we've seen such a revitalization and celebration of female God images. So Hildegard and Julian are just two representatives that have been a part of shifting this conversation, whether it's looking at Jesus as a mother in the case of Julian, or the extraordinary recovery, for example, of Mary Magdalene, and interests in Mary Magdalene over the last several decades. But I do think that there is an evolutionary aspect that's at work here, that has been around, as we would say from a Jungian perspective, the recovery of the feminine. And I believe, and I hope, and I feel very strongly that will continue for many, many years to come. So thank you so much. I'm going to close here. Here's a visual works cited section. Here's some of the text that I've mentioned here. Here's 2 English translations, one of Hildegard of Bingen's Scivias, and another of Julian of Norwich's Showings. And here's some other works that I think are very helpful for some further context or understanding of these 2 extraordinary female figures. So thank you so much for being here and celebrating all the extraordinary accomplishments of women, both in our lives personally, but also in the history of Christian mysticism, and all the female scholars that have done so much extraordinary work to put these women back on the map and give them their rightful place in the history of this extraordinary and rich tradition. So thank you so much again. And happy National Women's History Month.